There was no mention of the Cowessess First Nation by the Pope this morning at his Vatican address on this Sunday. On Thursday, as you may know, the First Nation announced the preliminary findings of 751 unmarked graves at the former Marival Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan. Joining us now to talk about that discovery is Saskatchewan MLA, NDP MLA, and residential school survivor herself, Betty Nippi-Albright. Nice to see you, Betty.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Well, we appreciate you doing this. Now that it's been a few days, how are you still processing the news?
I'm just emotionally exhausted. I've been speaking to a lot of fellow residential school survivors, and just talking to them about how triggering this has been for us. I was out in one of the communities yesterday doing some cultural ceremonies and sending prayers for all of us that to give us to help us to continue.
Yeah, I can't imagine how it brings back things. I don't know what you're willing to share about your own experience at a residential school, and what kinds of things came to mind when you heard this news, Betty?
Well, the first, when the 215 the discovery of the 215 unmarked graves in BC was very, as a mother and as a grandmother, I just could not imagine how, cannot imagine not saying goodbye and not knowing about my children, grandchildren.
Yeah.
And it also just triggered me back to my experience as a residential school. And then we knew, like many of us residential school survivors knew that, like, when it was the first time it was discovered, it was like, okay, yeah, now more are going to come. It wasn't a surprise for us. And with Cowessess, that was very triggering for us because it just brought back our own triggers of the trauma that we experienced going to residential school. Sure. And that was really hard. Emotionally, for myself, it was really hard because I had a brother who was run over by a tractor and spent months in a hospital without my parents ever knowing that he was hospitalized. And he came home in the summer to have mom and dad ask him why he had this huge scar. So for me, it brought back those kinds of memories, how my parents weren't notified. So I can't imagine, or I can imagine, because it happened to my brother. My brother fortunately survived, but had he not, would he have been notified?
You said you said in some of your remarks last week at a press conference that you too knew that there was a graveyard near the school where you attended, and there was someone on Twitter this week that tweeted, "Did your school have a graveyard?" And the answer, of course, for me is no. I wonder, just realizing that was such what kind of experience that is for someone to grow up knowing there was a graveyard near your school.
Where I went to school, we would go to the next community that had a residential school. We would go there for track and field, and we would speak to the other children that were our age, and they would be telling us about unmarked graves. So I knew about it as a kid growing up. And I was just back in the community that I went to residential school at earlier this week, and I was talking to other residential school survivors that while there doesn't seem to be any unmarked graves in the building, the school that I was in, that was the second residential school. There actually was an earlier one that burnt in 1927 or something like that in another area. And then there, I wouldn't be surprised that there would be unmarked graves there, because where I went to school was that was the second residential school that was built.
So tell me, Betty, what do you think has to happen next? Would you like to see more discovery of these children that were taken? Would you like to see more support from the federal government or provincial government in your case?
What needs to happen is it's a start with the funds that have been provided to help the communities search for unmarked graves. This is like, it took society how many years to hear us when we talked about the sexual and physical abuse that we endured. This is 2021. And society's waking up to hearing these unmarked graves. We're finally being heard. And when we talk about the Canadians or citizens of this country, as well as citizens of this country and this province, what federal and provincial governments need to do is release documents. If you've had provincially run schools, release those documents. Take ownership for your part in operating those residential schools. They could stop the suffering and continue to fund programs into to help us. Many of us as residential school survivors have been triggered by this. We're triggered. We're hurting. It brings up hurt that we've been dealing with for a long time.
Yeah.
And it just we need funding. And what federal and provincial governments need to do, if they want to do reconciliation in this country and in this province, in Saskatchewan in particular, reconciliation is more about placing monuments on grounds. It's about doing real work. It's about building relationships. It's about building trust between non-Indigenous and Indigenous people. It's about including First Nation, Métis leaders, Inuit leaders at intergovernmental tables. Is allowing them to, giving them that right to be at those tables to make those decisions. Yeah. And also, if you're creating programs and services that are going to support residential school survivors, that are going to support citizens, ensure that community and leaders are involved at the onset. Don't create a program and try and sell it to them after the fact.
Right. Betty, I so appreciate you talking to me after a really difficult week. I appreciate that it's been emotionally tiring, but I also appreciate that you wanted to talk a little bit more about it with me today. Thank you so much, Betty.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Have a good day.
Take care. You too. That's Betty Nippi-Albright. She's an NDP MLA and also a residential school survivor herself.